The story behind sour diesel. The accident that changed East Coast cannabis. Everyone has heard the name sour diesel. Even people who know very little about cannabis usually recognize it. But what most people don't realize is that this legendary strain wasn't the result of years of careful breeding or some master plan. It actually started with a mistake. Before we get into that story, if you're interested in the history of cannabis, legendary genetics, and the people who shaped the culture, you're in the right place. Now, let's rewind to the early 1990s. At the time, cannabis culture in the United States was developing along to very different paths. On the West Coast, growers were refining Kush genetics that would eventually become the backbone of California, cannabis. Across the country, the East Coast had its own underground network, smaller, more secretive, and built almost entirely on trust. Both regions would eventually produce strains that became icons. California had Og Kush, New York would get sour diesel. What's fascinating is that these two legends came into existence in completely different ways. Og Kush was the result of intentional selection. Growers recognized exceptional genetics and spent years preserving them. Sour diesel, on the other hand, existed because something went wrong. The story begins in New York during the mid-1990s. A grower known only as Age was cultivating ChemDog 91 alongside Super Skunk genetics that had been imported from Amsterdam. His setup followed the standard approach of the era: healthy female plants, no seeds, and controlled growing conditions. Then something unexpected happened. A male plant released pollen. The female plants became pollinated, and by harvest time they were full of seeds. For most growers, that would have been a complete disaster. Seeded flowers were worth less, produced lower quality harvests, and represented months of lost work. Many people would have thrown everything away and started over. Age didn't. Instead of seeing worthless seeds, he decided to grow them out just to see what would happen. That decision would change East Coast cannabis forever. Among those seedlings was one plant unlike anything anyone had encountered before. Its aroma wasn't earthy. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't floral. The room filled with an intense combination of fuel, citrus, and skunk that was impossible to ignore. People struggled to describe it. The closest comparison was the smell of diesel fuel mixed with fresh citrus peel. That unmistakable aroma eventually inspired the name, sour diesel. Part to the genetics behind the legend, but the accidental pollination is only part of the story. What truly made sour diesel special was the combination of genetics that came together in that grow room. To understand why this strain became so influential, we need to look at where those genetics came from. It all started with two very different plants. The first was ChemDog 91. Even back then, ChemDog had already earned a reputation for being something extraordinary. Its story dates back to 1991, when a small bag of cannabis purchased at a Grateful Dead concert contained a handful of unexpected seeds. Most people would have ignored them. Instead, those seeds were planted. One of the resulting plants stood out immediately. It produced an incredibly sharp chemical aroma unlike anything growers had experienced before. That fuel-like scent would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of sour diesel. ChemDog also contributed the energetic, uplifting effects that later made sour diesel famous among daytime smokers. The second piece of the puzzle came from the other side of the Atlantic. It was Super Skunk, a variety developed in Amsterdam by Sensi Seeds. Unlike ChemDog, Super Skunk wasn't created for its uniqueness. It was bred for consistency, heavy yields, and commercial production. By combining Skunk 1 with Afghan Indica genetics, breeders produced a plant that was reliable, productive, and easy to cultivate. When these two genetic lines unexpectedly crossed, the result was something neither parent could achieve on its own. ChemDog passed on its unmistakable fuel aroma and powerful cerebral effects. Super Skunk added dense flowers, vigorous growth, and impressive harvests. Together, they created a completely new profile that immediately caught growers' attention. But the story becomes even more interesting when you zoom out. The genetics behind sour diesel had already traveled across multiple continents. Before meeting in New York, the Afghan Indica lineage originated in the Hindu Kush Mountains. From there, it found its way to California during the wave of cannabis exploration in the 1970s. Later, many of those genetics were brought to Amsterdam, where Dutch breeders refined and stabilized them. Finally, some of those improved lines made their way to New York, where they unexpectedly combined with ChemDog. In a way, sour diesel wasn't just the product of one accident. It was the result of decades of global cannabis history converging in a single grow room. No breeder could have planned that journey, yet it ultimately produced one of the most recognizable cannabis strains ever created. Part 3: Why New York was the perfect place by the mid-1990s. New York City had become one of the most valuable cannabis markets in the United States. Quality flower that might sell for around $200 an ounce on the West Coast could easily fetch twice that price in Manhattan, sometimes even more. There were several reasons for that. New York had an enormous population of professionals, artists, musicians, and entrepreneurs who were willing to pay premium prices for exceptional cannabis. At the same time, getting high-quality product into the city carried serious risks. Law enforcement pressure was intense. Street-level policing had increased dramatically, making traditional dealing more dangerous than ever. Because of that, the market evolved differently. Instead of storefronts or open-air sales, cannabis moved almost entirely through private delivery networks. Everything depended on trust. You couldn't simply call a random dealer. Someone had to introduce you. Once you earned that trust, you received a phone number. You made the call. Then you waited. Usually within half an hour, someone would arrive with your order. Bike messengers became an important part of that underground economy. They already knew the city's streets better than anyone else and could move quickly, without attracting attention. To everyone else, they looked like ordinary delivery workers. That made them the perfect couriers. This was the environment where sour diesel first appeared, and oddly enough, its strongest advantage was also its biggest weakness: its smell. Unlike most cannabis available at the time, sour diesel couldn't be hidden. The moment someone opened a bag, the aroma spread through apartments, hallways, elevators, and entire buildings. For growers and dealers, that created obvious problems. The strain was impossible to keep discreet, but from a business perspective, that same smell became free advertising. People who had never heard of sour diesel suddenly wanted to know what they were smelling. Word spread naturally. Customers told friends. Friends told someone else. Without a single advertisement, the reputation of sour diesel grew throughout New York simply because people couldn't ignore its unmistakable aroma. Sometimes the product itself becomes the marketing, and that's exactly what happened here. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. This channel is just getting started, and there are plenty of fascinating stories still to come, from legendary cannabis strains and forgotten history to surprising facts from around the world. With every new upload, I'm working to make the editing, visuals, and storytelling even better. Thanks for being here from the beginning, and I'll see you in the next video.